So somebody had the temerity to recreate the Game Boy title Super Mario Land, an often ignored but still vital piece of the Super Mario Bros. Pie, and turned that into a Super Nintendo homebrew video game. Not only that, but they also had the gall to use the graphical stylings of the various new Super Mario Bros. Games that graced the more recent Nintendo systems, and even added a couple quirks from those games. The end result is New Super Mario Land, a rather intriguing and frankly quite impressive little homebrew game. Now I bring up the word homebrew, which means there's a ROM floating around somewhere, but you'll have to look for it yourself since Nintendo, well, let's just say them and unauthorized use of their intellectual properties have a rather contentious relationship, to put it mildly. However, the novelty aside, is New Super Mario Land something that you'd actually want to go out and play, or is it just a novelty game that you could skip out on and not miss a thing? Well, New Super Mario Land is an almost one-to-one recreation of the original Game Boy title it's based on, so all the level layouts are the same, the enemy behaviors, the power-ups, the various secrets and whatnots have more or less been retained. Even the two shooter levels made the cut into this port. So if you're familiar with old Super Mario Land on the Game Boy, the New Super Mario Land on the Super Nintendo should be pretty old hat. Now what isn't old hat is the new in New Super Mario Land, which isn't a whole lot, but there's quite a bit of it still. Namely, to go along with the new graphics based on the new Super Mario Bros. Style, there's also new gameplay based on that style of Super Mario. Like the old game, you have your basic power-up set. Mushrooms make Mario grow big and gives you an extra hit. Flowers makes you shoot super balls that bounce off walls, which is consistent with the Game Boy original. Stars provide temporary invincibility, and there are 1-ups and coins scattered about, as well as some hidden lifts to take you to higher parts of the level. However, there are also a couple changes from the old game. For instance, the removal of a time limit means you could explore these levels to your heart's content without rushing through them. That also means being able to scroll to the left, something you couldn't do in the original game, which makes things a little more manageable, especially in this version. Also conforming to the new Super Mario Bros. Standard, introduced in New Super Mario World or Land, or I get these stupid things confused. New Super Mario Land implements the wall slide and wall jump from those games, and I have rather mixed feelings in this regard. On the one hand, it's a nifty little feature to have for little things like carefully sliding down somewhat hazardous situations or reaching an otherwise unreachable spot without looking for those hidden lift blocks, possibly save you from an untimely pitfall, but more often than not, the wall slide is more of a detriment than anything, something that occurs to throw your game off, resulting in some rather unfortunate circumstances. I also find it odd that you add newer abilities that seem ill-fitting considering these levels were never made with those features in mind, and yet retained the old bounce mechanics of the old games. I guess I should elaborate on that a bit. In the old Super Mario Land, itself a take on the original Super Mario Bros. Game on the NES, you stomped on an enemy, you got a little bounce. Later Mario games, starting with the third one, made it so that if you stomped on an enemy while holding the jump button, gave you a bit more bounce, useful for reaching higher platforms and such. New Super Mario Land retains the old bounce mechanics, which means no big jump boost even if you hold button down. This is easy to forget due to the graphic style and extra bits, resulting in other unfortunate circumstances. Also worth noting is that the controls and physics feel a little more slippery and perhaps a bit more floaty than the Game Boy original. Now don't get me wrong, control and physics in Super Mario Land weren't quite on par with the NES Classic that kicked off the second phase of Jumpman's career, but it was serviceable enough for conquering the levels contained within. Here the gameplay is somewhat updated to the standards of New Super Mario Bros., as I've said, a series whose play control that I quite frankly was never a big fan of, often too loose and slippery for my tastes. Regardless, they are responsive and they do work, but whether the game is more playable here or in the original depends on the individual player's own tastes. And of course, there's the occasional bits of collision detection, like this for example. No comment. Now, it sounds like I'm bagging on the game quite a bit because I'm bringing up all these negative aspects, and there are quite a few, and a couple I've yet to mention. But for all the nagging little issues, this is still quite a sight to behold and experience. Once you get past the various quirks of the game, once you get used to them, New Super Mario Land was done from the ground up and does an otherwise admirable job of recreating the world of the Game Boy original, as well as the gameplay within. Like I said, the levels are recreated and they play out as you expect them to. The power-ups act as they did in the old games, as do the enemies and the few boss battles in the game. The game even includes the expert mode, the second quest that gets unlocked when you beat the game for the first time. And while it might not have the most refined controls, at least in my opinion, it does play better than most unauthorized uses of the Super Mario intellectual property, gracing some other 16-bit video game systems that I've played recently. And while I haven't tried it myself, I'd imagine the 4-player sessions added in, where each player has a Mario in a different colored outfit, would make for great party games, much like the new Super Mario Bros. Games on the more recent systems. So, in regards to the visuals, seeing the new Super Mario Bros. Style recreated on the Super Nintendo honestly shouldn't be that much of a big deal. We did have the Donkey Kong Country series and its pre-rendered stuff in its prime, so this sort of thing was always possible, but even with that in mind, this is still pretty neat to see. This is one person doing this after all. The animations of the characters, and Mario especially, are pretty smooth for the most part. The new characters take on a more cartoonish and entirely appropriate style for this sort of game. The levels themselves have some extra depth to them, including some lighting effects for lava and things of that nature, which is going above and beyond in my opinion. Of course, with this new graphical style comes two additional gripes. First being the lack of perspective. New graphics means everything is bigger, and thus you have limited upward scrolling to view the top part of what was already visible on a tiny Game Boy screen, which isn't very nice when stuff is happening off screen. I also would have liked a bit more control on camera perspective. Similar to what you'd have in Super Mario World, sometimes it feels like every jump I make to a moving platform is a leap of faith when I can't see it, and it really shouldn't be that. Still, it looks nice overall. As far as the audio goes, the music is great stuff, taking the old Game Boy tunes and turning them into somewhat new Super Mario style remixes done on SNES sound processing stuff. The sound effects are sourced from a variety of pre-existing games, and they sound about as good as you get on the system, though I could do without Mario shouting every time he jumps. It was irritating when done in the Super Mario Advance series. It's even worse here. Overall, New Super Mario Land for your Super Nintendo Entertainment System, emulator, or clone console of choice is a pretty impressive piece of business, especially considering only one person developed it. A labor of love, I suppose, and one that hopefully is a step towards a career in this sort of thing. There are issues, of course, but on a whole, this is a perfectly fine little recreation of an ancient video game on a 16-bit console with assets from later generations that form one fine package. Now, whether it's worth tracking down depends entirely on whether you're into a remake of an old game that was short to begin with and didn't have that much replayability. It's a ROM, so you could play it on an emulator on your computer or your Pi device, but ideally, this is best played on a Super Nintendo system with one of those EverDrive things where the experience feels much more complete. It's one thing to play a Super Nintendo ROM on an emulator with a random joystick thing, but playing this on a Super Nintendo system, even a clone system, with a Super Nintendo controller on hand, is where this really hits home, and in that regard, I'd say go for it. But I don't know, whatever. I thought it was pretty cool.